Hello everyone. This talk is really about a first glance of my thesis work as well as a collective work effort with me and Leke, what we did this summer in addressing two paradigms that are really important in river management. And I will first be talking about the biology side, or as we should really call it, Western aspects of science. So as we know, several rivers, including the Eel, are impounded, and this has significant implications for threatened fish, especially our salmon and trout, both in terms of blocking spawning habitat as well as increasing the buildup of fine sediment and indirectly contributing to earlier rises in summer temperatures. But what really hasn't been looked at as the upper Eel is the potential for impacts on the food availability. And I really would like to be able to build off of the great body of work that has already been done on the Eel. There's a good amount of work, as we all know, from the Power Lab in terms of what this food web tends to look like. And what I was curious to explore was, because this dam system creates basically kind of a drought environment, so you have a lot fewer frequencies of scouring floods as well as lower base flows, you likely probably see a lower buildup of that nutrient-rich complex of the Cladophora and the diatoms, which really feed to the higher trophic levels, especially with those vulnerable grazers. And it also, because of the less of a scour, you tend to see more of those invulnerable grazers that are not as available to the fish and are really reducing the amount that's moving up through the food web. And this comes at an important time because on the Eel River, just to give you a background on this dam system, is it's a two-dam system called the Potter Valley Project. It's been in place for about 100 years. And so you first have the Scott Dam, which completely blocks passage, creating Lake Pillsbury. And then between the two dams is the diversion tunnel to the Russian River. And diversions are occurring mostly over the summer. Up to 75% of the Eel River flows can be diverted. And I was starting to look right below Van Arsdale, and this is a really important part because these dams are actually coming up for their FERC relicensing. PG&E has actually already put in their application, so the process has begun. And so this would come at a good time to see, is there any impacts on the ecosystem at large? And this system of the river is actually relatively understudied. So overall, the study was really trying to actually look at both the algae and the macroinvertebrates in combination on the upper Eel below the dam system and comparing it to the Middle Fork, which actually at their confluence are similar in drainage area. And I want to highlight this picture because this is actually at the confluence at Dos Rios. And you see the large muddy river coming in is actually the Middle Fork feeding into the Mainstem. And at this point in May, the Middle Fork was coming out at 3,000 CFS versus the Mainstem was at 300 CFS and dropping fast. So what my study looked like was there were two study sites on each river, two being at Dos Rios. The idea being is that's where the rivers are mostly alike, and then one directly below the dam, and then another one on the Middle Fork at a similar point in the watershed. And at each site, I sampled 3 riffles, utilizing methods both from the SWAMP protocol as well as from the Power Lab. I was really fortunate to work with them on their Eyes on the Eel study, and I kind of built off of those methods, looking at the algae, the macroinvertebrates, and those related physical parameters. But today I'm just going to be focusing on what did I find with the bugs. And just to give you a better sense of what these regulated flows look like, I do want to caution, this is pulling gauge data from 2 different points in these rivers. So the Middle Fork is at Dos Rios, while the Mainstem flows are actually up at Van Arsdale, but it is unlikely that it's much different. I will be correcting for this later on. But as you can see, the Mainstem in orange is much lower starting by April. They did experience some scouring floods, which is one of the first times in several years, but the flows were dropping out much earlier. And so I wanted to start sampling basically as soon as was feasible. I had large grand ideas of sampling into April, but as you can see, that wasn't feasible, especially with this high water year. So our first sampling point was in June, and then we had a second point in July, and finally in September. And so to finally look at what was actually really going on in this summer period, I want to kind of zoom in on that. So in the first sampling point, the Middle Fork was still a bit higher, although dropping very fast, as it's actually pretty typical of the Middle Fork. It does experience some snow melt, so it does stay higher, but it drops out really fast. And so while at first it was higher, by the second sampling point, they were at a similar point in CFS, and then by late September, the Middle Fork was dropping below 30 CFS, and the Mainstem actually stayed constant. This is a direct effect of the flow regulation. Basically what they do is decide for the rest of the summer what the flow is going to be like, and this year, because it was a good water year, they actually had 40 to 50 CFS throughout the entire summer. Just as a comparison, in 2015, they were down to 9 CFS, so it can range very, very much. So what did we do with my study this summer was a twofold effort, both doing a kicknet sample to get at like big questions like the ecosystem health using functional feeding groups, which is what I'll talk about, and then in terms of drift sample. While I'd sampled every time, the key period, and that I'm going to highlight here, is the first sampling period when juvenile Chinook are moving out of the system, so there is the potential for food limitation. And so once those were collected, of course, we went back in the lab and did taxonomic identification. I'm still in the process of that, getting everything down to the genus level, confirming that I'm actually doing this right. And then to get an estimate of biomass, specifically in the drift, I will be using established length weight regressions. So what did we find in terms of the benthic groups? So I want to highlight those first two sampling periods, and I also want to mention that with these functional feeding groups, I slightly altered one, which is the grazers. So typically what you have is the grazers are those scrapers that are scraping directly off the parafine, but because, as we all know, if you're familiar at all with eel, is the Cladophora make up a good portion of where your algae is. And so I wanted to add those groups in, like the hydroptilids and the pseudochironomus, that are clearly feeding off the algae but not on the rocks, which is not what the functional feeding group was really derived from. So at first in June, they were relatively similar in composition, especially because the grazers were really dominated by those scraper groups. Cladophora hadn't quite built up yet, so there was a lot still of those heptageneids and just really a bit of trichops and things like that. I will say the diversity has seemed rather low. I will be very curious to see, once I can confirm with experts, the complete diversity. But into July, what I actually saw was there was an increase in filtering collectors, and when I mean filtering collectors, I generally mean those simulids, as I have a picture of. We were generally finding these large, almost I would say a colony on rocks of simulids. But while they were found in both the Mainstem and the Middle Fork, what we didn't really get in the Mainstem was an increase in these grazers that are like the pseudochironomus and the hydroptilids. So there's a potential here that there is a difference, and I will note, but I don't have this up here, is that it did seem like the Cladophora in terms of percent cover and average filament length was significantly lower in the Mainstem, so it definitely seems like the bugs are indicating that. But what we found in terms of the drift, which was kind of shocking, honestly, how low it was. As you can see in both of the dam sites, they were very low. And in the Middle Fork sites, they were much higher. And while it looks like there's a significant contribution of terrestrial, I want to emphasize that in the Middle Fork sites, most of these terrestrials that we are finding are emerging betids. So I believe you can confirm that while they're terrestrial, they're still of aquatic origin, versus something in the Mainstem, especially directly below the dam, because there has been such an increase in cover with willows and cottonwoods. I saw a much more diverse diverse taxa in the terrestrial groups, some things like ants, wasps, all of those alike. And how did this play out in terms of composition? This actually kind of trends as well to what Gabe was finding in like those smaller tribs in the eel. Was the major contributor, of course, was our highly mobile batids. Second was the simulids. It doesn't really seem that the diversity varied that much across the sites. The only one that really stuck out to me was the Mainstem confluent site. Only really had 3 families represented. And it also should be noted, it was just a really low sample size. And this may be due to ideally, of course, drift should be measured more than once. But it was a very curious thing because the drift, as I mentioned before, was low at both the Mainstem sites on different days. So just wrap that all up, in terms of this wet high year, it still seems that the Mainstem, because of the flow regulation, which causes such a deep drop in flow, may be supporting a less productive system. And this may have implications for further up in the food web in terms of our juvenile Chinook. Because those drift abundances were so much lower, and we are seeing lower numbers of our vulnerable grazers. And my next steps, obviously, will be doing further community analysis, and I am very interested and excited to be here to hear expert opinions. So if you have any ideas, I would love to hear from you afterwards. But I will now be turning this over to Leke, who I feel very fortunate to work with. He's been an amazing collaborator, and I'm excited to see where he goes.
So, located along the middle fork of the Eel River is the Round Valley Indian Reservation, and it is home to a confederation of smaller tribes that make up the Round Valley Indian tribes. And these tribes have been in this Eel River region for time immemorial, for up to 13,000 years. And they've expressed discontent with state and federal agencies in terms of not having their voices heard in management and in having the perspectives actually honored in this dam relicensing process. And so their perspective comes from an indigenous science standpoint, or a traditional ecological knowledge standpoint, as it is commonly termed. And indigenous science is a process of knowing. Here we go, sorry. And indigenous science is a process of knowing and interacting with the environment that is passed down in indigenous communities through generations. And it is typically transmitted through stories. And so what we did was we went to the UC Berkeley archives and we looked at ethnographic field notes collected by Alfred Kroeber, who was an anthropologist from Berkeley. And he collected stories from elders in the Round Valley region during the early 1900s. So basically we looked through tons of microfilms and we looked for stories that specifically talked about the Eel River fish and fishing practices within this system. And we then took those stories and we transcribed them. And so what we did was we took the transcribed stories and the stories themselves, and we went to the Round Valley community and we asked elders, how would you interpret these stories? How would these stories have implications for ecosystem management? And so based off of their interpretations and personal interpretations based off of indigenous science literature and previous experience with interpreting indigenous science stories, we took all of that and put it into NVivo 11, which is a coding program that creates themes or nodes based off of common themes within text. And we also put in excerpts from Western science literature, so from textbooks and from also scientific papers and from management bulletins, in order to see if there were overlaps between these two knowledge bases. And what we found was that there were 3 common themes within both paradigms. And the first one was social and cultural implications. The second was fish, and this could be in terms of abundance, range, or life history traits. And then we also looked, and then also ecosystem and hydrology. And so using this coding from NVivo, we created a conceptual framework on how to integrate Western and indigenous science into management. So basically, the first question you need to ask is, which paradigm are you operating within? And once you decide if you're operating with an indigenous perspective or from a Western perspective, you would continue to flow down towards that paradigm, and then you would ask question 2, which is, what are you trying to manage for? So we have our 3 themes here. So you can be managing for social and cultural practices, fish, or for ecosystem and hydrology. And based off of the paradigm you chose, you would flow towards either the left or the right column. So if you chose the indigenous paradigm, you would come to a reference table, and it would show you the excerpt from the story. And so for this particular example, it talks about this idea of the phoenix concept and of the uksa, or the water eagle. And basically, wherever the water eagle is, you cannot fish. And so this is directly from the text from the archives. And then you would flow over to the next column, and this describes the interpretation. So the interpretation of this story is that Yuki religion and social mechanisms guided the use of taboos in fishery management. The areas frequented by the uksa are no-catch zones that protected specific fishing habitats. In other indigenous societies, sacred areas or taboo habitats commonly protected important species recruitment, focal locations, pinch points within the system, or critical life history stages. And so then you would return back to this graph, and if you chose the Western paradigm, you would come back to the same reference table and look at this column, which contains excerpts from Western science literature. And basically, you would find an overlap in that steelhead fishing within the Eel River system, especially in important breeding spots for salmon steelhead, are restricted fishing zones, and this comes from cow trout and other management agencies. And you would return back to our conceptual framework and go to number 3, and basically you would ask, do you need more holistic information about management in the system? And if you do, then you would cross over to the paradigm that you originally didn't choose. And if you don't feel like learning more about the system, then you can stop or start again at 1 and look for another management theme. But basically, you need to ask the question, if you do find a paradigm, an overlap between the 2 paradigms, what do you do about this? How do you actually use this kind of knowledge and integrate them and address a lot of these issues that we're talking about today? And so if there is a bridge, you need to first of all contact the tribes in the area that you're working with, and you need to ask for approval, ask for be respectful and ask for that respect, and you need to set up an open avenue for collaborative research. And then on the other side, you need to identify, prioritize, and address constraints in management, and this comes primarily from Kate Setting's paper about alternative stable states and her conceptual framework for ecosystem management. But basically, if you do have an overlap between these 2 paradigms and you integrate them into management, you'll have adaptive ecocultural management. And so if you're able to bridge these 2 paradigms and honor them in the right way, you'll be able to have more holistic and more rewarding management for the system you're trying to address. And so we would like to acknowledge our advisors, Allison O'Dowd and Sifa Ramos, and then our respective institutions. A lot of the framework for bridging indigenous and Western science for me came from this research program I was a part of this summer called LULUSIC out of Humboldt State University. And yeah, that's
Here's time for like one question for you, Laura, right?
Thanks. I'm just wondering if this eco-cultural management practice has been implied before, or is this something that's kind of new? It's the first time I've heard of it.
It's been applied in many different systems across the world. I'm from Hawaii, so I know of the Hawaiian perspective and how in Hawaii they've been combined in many different circumstances for, let's say, like watershed management or for sustainable agricultural purposes. And even in Northern California, the Yurok and Karuk tribes have done a lot of work with eco-cultural management with state agencies and their tribal fisheries management agencies.